When I was near the end of my 40 years in education, I realised that I had participated in a quiet revolution, because the classes that I taught at the beginning of my career in the 1950s, though they were much larger and though the schools had far fewer resources, they were much more easily managed than the classes that I observed in the 1990s, which were fewer in number and infinitely better resourced. So there had to be something that brought about that change. And I began to realise that it was in this area that we commonly refer to as values. So when the reforms known as Tomorrow's Schools came along, and their provision for schools to include in their charter local learning objectives, it seemed to me that we should address this issue. And so at Waihopai School, where I was at the time, the Board of Trustees included the teaching of Cornerstone values as their only local learning objective. Now, while that was quite an achievement, it was only the beginning, because the way of teaching had to be rediscovered. And so that was the beginning of the journey that has led to the material that I now refer to as the Cornerstone Values approach to character education. There are three things that I should tell you about the approach, or tell you that the approach is not. The first is, it's not a religious program. Even though all the world's major religions and philosophies, and even those without any religion, would uphold and advocate the values that I refer to as Cornerstone values. The program is not a life skills program either, although people up and down the country have told me that it provides a basis that makes many life skills programs more meaningful, purposeful, and likely to succeed. And finally, it isn't a program at all. It isn't something that you add on to the curriculum. It's something that you absorb into the curriculum. I should also tell you that the approach recognises that the first and most important teachers of values or of character are parents. That nothing can ever replace the home as the place where children begin to develop character simply by watching their parents being. But there are other influences that are significant. One is one's friends, the social environment, the popular culture with the media and films and television and so on, and the internet, I guess, and also significant relationships. And those significant relationships are often teachers, sports coaches, or youth leaders, and so on. Schools historically have always played a very important part in the development of character. Traditionally, they referred to it as character training, and right up until recent decades, it was central to schooling. It was said that schools had two aims. One was to help young people master the skills of literacy and numeracy, and the second aim was to help young people to be good. And that went right back through the generations to Plato, who had said, we educate people to make them good because good people behave nobly. It sounds very quaint and very old-fashioned, but teachers of 3 or 4 generations ago would be surprised that we were even discussing the place of character in education. Now, the New Zealand Curriculum Framework makes the statement that attitudes and values, along with knowledge and skills, are integral parts of the New Zealand curriculum. Now that values and attitudes hints at character. But it's very difficult to interpret because values means all things to all people. In fact, if I'd been talking to you 120 years ago, I wouldn't have been using the word values because the word hadn't been invented. Up until that time, value was always used in the singular to mean the worth of something. What is the worth of this Walkman radio? Or value in the sense of, I value the opportunity to hold in high regard. I value the opportunity to share with you. Now, the German philosopher Nietzsche believed that people were being imprisoned by the old virtues, the classical virtues and the Judaic-Christian virtues. And he felt that people should be set free from them and they should be free to choose their own virtues. So he developed this idea of personal virtues, which he called values. And so the word values has been absorbed into the vocabulary of the Western world. Now, Nietzsche was pretty excited about his values because he thought it was the most significant event in human history. He said there'll be no good and there'll be no bad, there'll be no right and there'll be no wrong, and people will be set free. So that's the history of the word values. So values, you know, can be all things to all people. But the interesting thing is that values don't exist in a vacuum. All values stem from a belief. And in terms of values education, there are two beliefs that are important. The first is whether or not there are core values or objective values, or whether there are no objective values. So if you are of the belief that there are no objective values, then the values that you will hold will be preferences, like tea or coffee or milk or sugar or long hair rather than short hair. If the values that you hold stem from the belief that there are objective values, then they will be principles. Now, the preference values will be subjective because you will be the judge of their correctness, whereas the principle values will be objective. The value of their correctness, or whether they're right or wrong, lie beyond the individual. But there's another very important difference between these two types of values, the preference values and the principle values. Now, the preference values are something to have, like I have this Walkman. So in terms of my values, I'm able to say my values are as good as your values in the same way as I can say my Walkman's as good as your Walkman. But if I'm talking about values that are principles, they're not something to have, they're something to be, like kindness or honest. And of those things you can't say my kindness and my honesty is as good as yours, because its correctness lies beyond me, it's not owned. Now C.S. Lewis, who came along about 50 years after Nietzsche, researched dozens and dozens of civilizations, and he was looking at what their values were, and he came to the conclusion that in all civilizations there are some values that are held in common. He not only came to the conclusion that they had values that were held in common, but he also said that they were there as part of creation. They were part of reality, and that we denied them at our peril. And he went on to describe in this book the abolition of man, how important these values were. And he talked about us, you know, demanding the function, but destroying the origin of function. And he compared that to the human heart. He said, you know, if you were to take a person's heart out, you could no longer, it would be unreasonable to expect the liver and the brain and the kidneys and all the rest of it to function as if the heart was still in place. And he was likened that to these core objective values in society, that they're there for a purpose, and you can't have particular outcomes and behaviours if you destroy the source of where they come from. Now, C.S. Lewis set out all his research in what he called the illustrations of the Tao, an appendix to the abolition of man. And he used words like veracity and benevolence and magnanimity, and he set them out in laws. But they're not the words that we would use today. So the 8 cornerstone values are honesty and truthfulness, kindness, consideration, concern for others, compassion, obedience, respect, responsibility and duty. Now, some of those values make us feel a bit uncomfortable today. Obedience, for example, is unfashionable. Some people say, yes, but of those values there are 2 that are more important than any other, and they are responsibility and respect. And in the cornerstone values, those 2 are seen as key values because they tie on or lead into 2 other aspects of the teaching content that I'll refer to a little later on. But these values are so important because of the way they work. They work in 3 ways. You see, if I am to be compassionate, I first must know what compassion is. And if no one tells me, I won't know what compassion is, nor will I know why it is important for me to be compassionate. So each of these cornerstone values has a knowledge part. I refer to it as the head. But having knowledge of, say, compassion doesn't make me compassionate. Even though the Greeks believed that if you gave people knowledge, that would lead to their well-being. And, you know, contemporary programs, for example, anti-smoking programs, concentrate on knowledge without going on to the other 2 components which are critical. And the other 2 components are the cornerstone values, that helps to make me compassionate is, to the knowledge of compassion, I must add the desire to be compassionate. And if I have no desire to be compassionate, even though I have all the knowledge about compassion, I won't be compassionate. So these 3 parts involve, firstly, the head, and then they involve the heart. But still that doesn't make me compassionate, because to be compassionate, I must actually be compassionate. I must behave compassionately. So there's an action or a behaviour. So the cornerstone values work in 3 parts that involve the head, the heart and the hand. The curriculum developer would say they involve knowledge, attitudes and behaviour. These are very important aspects of a cornerstone value. But before I go on and explain a little more about that, let me tell you something else about these values. The first is they're universal. You know, honesty is honesty in Ireland, Iceland and in Invercargill. It's universal. It's consistent. It's consistent. Doesn't change. Honesty was honesty in 1066, is in 2002 and will be in 3041. They're transcultural. They belong to all cultures, even though different cultures may give expression to some of them in different ways. All cultures value such things as honesty and truthfulness and so on. And finally, these values determine behaviour. Another aspect of their universal application is that they are the same, or they apply to the family as well as the classroom, to the business as well as the community organisation. So there's a universality about them that is very important. And its importance was probably recognised by our forebears better than our generation, because our forebears knew that these core objective values are inextricably linked to character. We don't talk much about character today. If we're employing someone, we are more interested in their competencies than their character. Though in the past, character was seen as critical. There are many definitions of character. Someone says, character is who we are when no one sees. But character is also knowing the good, desiring the good, and doing the good. And it's those aspects of character, the head, the heart, and the hand, that link them inextricably to core objective values. So character determines behaviour, and behaviour demonstrates character. Character always reminds me of an old wagon wheel. You see, the rim is like character, where rubber hits the road, the behaviour, the working bit. But the spokes are all of equal length and equal distance, and they give the wheel character, its form and its shape, and they are the cornerstone values. There's no hierarchical order. One is not more important than the other, and they all play their part. They all fuse together. They work in harmony. And the other essential part of the wagon wheel is the hub, the bit in the centre, because that holds the spokes, the values in place. And in terms of character, the hub is the very special cornerstone values, duty, which really is obligation. And again, we moderns have problems with duty because we tend to think of it in terms of flags and sacrifice to queen and country and so on. But duty is far more than that. And if you read C.S. Lewis's writings, you'll find that out. Duty is your obligation to the community, to the neighbourhood, to society, to be honest and truthful, kind and compassionate, responsible and respectful. You see, a businessman may say, it's always my policy to be honest, to give the correct change and to give quality for price. But that's really not the right reason that a businessman should be honest. A businessman should be honest because it's obligation, his obligation to the community, to society, to behave in an honest and honourable way. So these cornerstone values are critically important for or in many of the issues that worry schools, that worry families and worry communities. Because cornerstone values are the basis of character. And character is what determines behaviour. And it's responsible behaviour that leads to good citizenship and a sense of community and what we would all desire, a civil society, a just and caring society where there is concern for the well-being of others.